All right, I'm going to pause you right there. I know you're super excited to jump right into it. All right, so let's talk about seasons of school life. On the back of your cover, the back of your agenda there are a couple of arrows for you to take notes on this section. So we're going to use some of my favorite things, e-cards, to learn about the seasons of school life, right? The summer is going by so slow, said no teacher ever. Right? Like right now, you're thinking like it's almost here. And in a second, you will blink and it will be almost gone. And you're like, what just happened? I waited all year for that, right? And as Allie mentioned, we do tend to lead a September to June life, right? And there are certain events and timelines that are like, they kind of mark the passing of time. It's like, if I survive until this point, then I'm doing pretty well. Or if I can get this done by that point, I'm doing pretty well. So obviously summer's the big one. One of my other favorite ones, report cards, right? When there is a progress report or report card coming, you know it's coming from 14,000 miles away because everyone is talking about it and the energy rises up, right? In buildings. So if I can get it done by report cards, I'm good to go. And then of course, there's always the test. And I love this card because it totally makes me think of the test administration manual. The TAM, as we like to call it. Because when you read it, you're like, oh my gosh, like it's like 400 pages long, and it's like if you deviate from any of these things, you'll be reported, you'll lose your license, and you'll be killed, right? Like, it's like, hey, and then we're telling everybody, like, just be calm and relaxed, right? Just like, don't stress out about it. And they're like, oh my gosh, did I say the wrong words? I think they said that wrong order, right? So these are the things that sort of mark the school year. And sadly, some of these things are big stressors for teachers. The test is definitely one of them. And what's interesting to me is, generally speaking, people start freaking out about the test in the beginning of April, right? Maybe March, right? And what I always tell people is this, and I know it doesn't give them much peace in the moment, but it does make them laugh. I always say, if you're freaking out about the test right now, it's too late. And they're like, thanks a lot, coach, that's real cool. And I'm like, the time to freak out about the test is August. Because that's when the time is for you to make a plan that will actually have a different outcome. There is nothing that you will do in the last 3 weeks before you walk the kids in there that is going to make their whole life change. That's going to make them go from far to go to exceeding. That's just not how it works. And so sadly, this calendar that we tend to live in is sometimes limiting to us, and it can cause us to make poor decisions and put us in a frantic place when that's not necessarily needed. So here's what I want you to do. In your notes today, there is an actual school calendar. I'm going to give you 5 minutes, and I just want you, with an elbow partner, I want you to mark these things. High stress teacher times. Okay, just put a little check mark on the days. Okay? Right? You're like, wait a minute, how much of this calendar can I fill in? Hold on, don't start yet. I know you're excited. But I also want you to think about high stress student times. For example, we know that students in poverty tend to ramp up before breaks. Right? Their anxiety about being home and what may happen over those weeks can cause the energy of students to really fluctuate, and that shows up often in our SWIS data, right? So I want you to be thinking about both of those things. When are teachers really having high stress? There's a lot going on for them. And when are students experiencing high stress as well? They could be the same days, they could be different. So you got 5 minutes. I want you to talk and mark those days. And here's a tip. You can't mark them all. All right, ready? Wait for the signal word. May. May. Okay, let's do it. All right, friends, I'm going to stop you right there. That wasn't really 5 minutes, but Okay, pause where you're at. Tell your neighbor to stop talking. Okay, friends, pause for a second. Okay, I'm stopping you because you were way too fast at that test. You didn't need 5 minutes. You were like, I know exactly what was terrible. It was April. I wrote it down. Okay. So when you think about this high stress time, someone said, do we also get a lunar calendar? Because that could sway our vote, right? It's true. Not a bad idea to line that one up when you make plans for next year. Here's the thing. We tend to lead this September to June life. And you know, clearly right there, everybody was able to say these are the times when it comes up and it goes down. However, teams cannot afford to live that same timeline. The problem is the way we have the school calendar set up, we do, right? We kind of have those like very clear marks in the sand that we're like, okay, this is when pre-service is, this is when it's over, you're free on your own, right? They can't do that because if they live in that same September to June life, they're going to live almost entirely reactive instead of proactive. Okay? If they come back in the fall and they have no plans, there's not that much time for them to make a good one. Right? This is one of the reasons why we see new teachers sometimes struggle. Because they're like, oh my gosh, like you're ripping the Band-Aid off. It goes fast. We open the doors and the kids just keep on coming every day. There's no time to slow down and think and be like, hey, what are we going to do here? But the key is for us as supports, we need to help break teams out of the cycle of the September to June life. So you guys remember me talking about this probably from last month about what we monitor and support, right? And so you have your pre-service, early winter, all of these, right? In pre-service, we really look at the norms and the roles. And we say, hey, you know, you've got a new team member. Did you guys figure out who's going to do what? How you want to function together? In fall, we're really looking in on agendas. Do you have them? Are there times on them? Are you deconstructing the standards? Then in winter, we're really saying, all right, let's just keep it going. How's the cycle progressing? Are you keeping with it? Have you abandoned it? Right? And then in spring, we want to start digging in and saying, hey, let's look at that assessment and make sure that these really match. Right? And finally, in late spring, we have reflection and goal setting. So this is kind of what we monitor and support on a building level. However, in order for these things to be monitored, they have to be happening. So if I want to monitor something in pre-service, I got to think about when I'm going to have them do that, because they don't just show up there with it magically done. So let's talk about seasons of team life. And I'm going to use year one as like this is the current year, and year two as the year that's coming up, okay? So in the spring of year one, which is right now, we want them actually doing step one for their fall cycle. So take that in for just a moment there. In May of the current year, you need to have step one done for the cycle that you're going to come back and do when they walk through the door. So they're going to go through, they're going to deconstruct the standard, they're going to make a unit plan, they're going to create the assessment, and they're going to pass that assessment to the grade level below them to administer. So if I'm third grade and in the fall we're doing multiplication, I'm going to create an assessment that I pass back to second grade to give sometime this spring. Okay? And you got to work with teams on this. This is not the easiest thing to do, but it's a game changer. So what happens is second grade administers that assessment and they hand us the full stack, right? We just keep the whole pack. And when we come back in pre-service, now we have information about our students before they even walk through the door. So they don't have to come to my class and start failing. I can start putting in scaffolds from the minute they walk through the door. And it's actually one of the most magical moments for both teachers and students. Teachers, because when they come back in fall, they frankly forgot that they had done step one, and they're like, oh my gosh, we have such a good unit plan. And they feel ready, they feel calm, they feel prepared, right? For students, they will talk about the school year differently. They'll say, this year is so much better, this is such a better teacher, it's so much easier. And the reason is they're not failing before we support them. We know who our learners are before they walk through the door. We have a little window into helping them be successful in our classroom. And of course, they're also thinking about what do we want to do differently as a team next year. And I really encourage people to do this in May because frankly, once you get to June, it's about survival and fun. right? You get your field days, your talent shows, your award things, right? And everyone's just like, I just got to make it to the end. That's not a time when people are thinking, hey, how do I grow as a professional? No, they're thinking, how am I going to get a tan? Okay, so if you back that up into May, there's a magic window in there where people are able to think about those things. And I would really tell you, like, the 29th of May is kind of like your cutoff for thoughtfulness. Okay? Okay, so that's the first season. Then during pre-service, you have teachers who are really vacillating, right, between excitement and anxiety. I've got my new class coming in, and there's kind of this back and forth about it, right? And they're trying to make sure every single thing is ready, and they'll be prepared in such a fashion that they never are for the rest of the year. But that's what they're hoping for, right? You've got the new norms and rules, agenda setting backwards, which means they're planning. They're saying, hey, if this is where the last unit has to start, let's fill that into our running agenda now. I'm saying, hey, the last unit has to start on May 2nd. So that means 2 weeks before that, I would have needed to give the pre-assessment. A week before that, I would need to make that pre-assessment. And if they do that for their whole year in pre-service, they can then follow that plan. And it doesn't mean that it's going to be lockstep and perfect, but it's kind of a placeholder so that people don't suddenly go, oh my gosh, we're 3 units behind. How did that happen? Right? If they have those things on their running agenda, that will keep them moving. And then, of course, they're using that pre-assessment to process and make a differentiated plan for instruction before kids have arrived. Okay, that's kind of a lot. And that's all happening in May and pre-service. So I want to give you just a second, and I want you to turn and talk. What in there are you like, I never thought about that before? May. Okay, talk to a neighbor. Okay, guys, stop right where you're at for a second. Couple of good questions already. One of them is about kinder. Okay, so of course, kinder doesn't have a magic friend to pass their assessment to. They're still doing step 1 for their fall cycle, and what they're really asking themselves is, what information can I get and the earliest that I can get it, right? So on those days when the kids come early, can we give a little something then to get information about this, or will it need to start a bit later and act more as a progress monitor instead of a pre? But they're still doing step 1. They just don't get the fun assessment pass. Okay. Other burning questions out there? None. Yes, Phil.
When we were talking about like that stress about testing season, so needing to, especially for 3, 4, and 5, to add that CFA for like the math units we've been planning on top of STAR assessments for the reading levels and SBAC, because we're usually pushing it all the way to the end of the year. So
yes, so think about it this way.
Do it now, or we want to do it right when they get back from the...
So test stress tends to be highest in April. Once they're midway through the assessment or more, people are kind of like, well, what it's going to be is going to be. And so the stress tends to come down a little bit because they're like, well, the ship has sailed, right? And so that's why we say May to May. You want to really do that in May because they're well into their assessment at that point and they're kind of like, okay, it's going to happen. And so, yeah, there's definitely a layering effect where you want to be thoughtful about what else is happening. And I don't recommend to anyone giving a specific time to make teams do this unless you have a PD day. So if you have a PD day in that window and you want to set aside 3 hours and let them do it during that time, that's awesome because they weren't going to be doing something else anyways and now they feel ready. But really it's about having it happen sometime in the first few weeks of May. And the team can decide like this is the week when we have that availability. And then that assessment that they're giving, number one, it needs to come with specific instructions of how to administer it. Number two, teachers know their colleagues. They're not trying to give them a one-on-one interview that's going to take 100 hours because they know they'll be killed. So they try to make it pretty easy and they say, here's the assessment. You could give it as morning work. You could give it as a ticket out the door. Please don't let kids spend more than 15 minutes on it. Just collect it. And they're not going to score it. So if I'm the second grade teacher and I'm administering the third grade assessment, I'm just going to give it, I'm going to collect it, I'm going to say, hey guys, I'm going to give this to your teacher for next year. She's going to know how to support you when you get there. And I'm done. So the total commitment between the team that you're receiving it from and you is the amount of time that it needs to be administered in class. It should be no or low prep. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, if you're having that moment where you're like, oh my gosh, it's May now, we didn't do this, it's ruined, don't stress. What I want you to be thinking about, and I know some of you have done the May to May life, you're doing it right now. I want you to be thinking about how do we best position ourselves to be able to be here next year. Okay, that's why you have next year's calendar, not this week's calendar. I'm not asking you to turn around tomorrow and make a miracle happen. And certainly don't add it to your teacher's plates right now. They will kill you and then probably me, since they'll find out I told you. Okay, so think about what do we need to do now to make sure. So for example, you need to know you have to have all of your current units of study ready to roll before you start that one. I can't make a plan for next year if I don't have a plan for tomorrow, right? So you want to be thinking about how do you kind of get the ducks in a row to allow it to happen. So then what happens in the fall is they start getting into those cycles earlier. The other nice thing for the teachers who are not always on the Data Team Love page, they love not having to give an assessment like the second kids walk through the door. And when you say to them, hey, if we give it this spring and you know what to do, you can spend that time building classroom community and learning about them and loving them and all those things. People are like, oh, that's kind of nice. I like that idea. And it is kind of nice to be able to come into your new class and not the first day be handed something where I can't help you. Right? So they get going in those cycles faster, and they also have the availability to respond to your feedback. So you can get on it earlier and say, hey, I know that first cycle is already going, and here's some feedback on that. And you're talking first, second week of school. Right? So it just starts faster. Instead of having them start behind, they're giving a pre-assessment when they've already started instruction. Now you've actually got it in the right order. Then in the winter, teams tend to vacillate between survival and hope. Right? We're surviving and we know Christmas is coming soon. There's hope, right? Then after that, it's like, oh my gosh, it's a long time till spring break. And teams are vacillating once again. And they're continuing to progress through their cycles. And finally, in the spring of year 2, that would be next May, you're doing the same thing. We're saying, hey, how did our team grow and change this year? What do we want to do differently? And what do we want to launch for our fall cycle? Now, here's the thing. When you talk about that excitement, anxiety, survival, and hope, this is the second arrow. And it helps people lean more towards excitement and hope and less towards anxiety and survival. Those little brown dots that are around the data team process are there for a reason at every step, because we need to have a very clear process for giving teams feedback, specific feedback, giving them an opportunity to reflect, having many opportunities to celebrate the work that they're doing, even if it's a misstep, right? We have to celebrate that failure too, because this is an inquiry-based process. So if we try something and it doesn't work, we still get a high five. And then repeating that. So the more time you can get that reflection celebration built in throughout the year, the more you get on the happiness side of teachers' feelings. When you have a teacher who's actually taught their priority standards and is on track, on time with what they planned, when they come to the assessment window, watch what happens. It's a whole different thing. And truly, you probably don't know many people who've ever done that, because they're always behind. They're always doubting themselves. They're always wondering, did I do enough? But when they make a plan, that they can actually follow, and they follow it, they're kind of like, ooh, I wonder how it's going to go. Like, maybe this will really work. And it does. And it's a very exciting moment to help teams get to that place. But we have to interrupt that September to June and start thinking May to May, because that's what team life is. Okay, so here is your turn and talk. Which of these have you observed? Which of the places? You're like, yes, I've totally seen the excitement. I've definitely seen the anxiety, right? And then how would the flow for your teams change if you actually lived a May to May life? And for those of you who are starting May to May life, I want you to think about how the conversations have changed for your teams now. Okay? So you have 3 minutes to turn and talk. May. Friends in the back, will you share your great question that you had about mobility?
We were just talking about the May to May, how depending on how much your staffing might be changing, or team grade levels, new teachers, new whatever, blends, how that might be challenging when you're thinking about planning for creating assessments for the fall.
Perfect. Okay, so first thing is, teacher mobility on this topic does not matter. And it's actually more beneficial to have the current team do it because they're the ones who are most familiar with the grade level standard. Okay? Now, I want you to pretend that, team of 3 people comes up with it, and then they find out that assessment goes down to 2nd grade, and none of them are teaching 3rd grade next year. Imagine the joy of the person who arrives to teach 3rd grade, and they have a map to work off of and assessments in hand. Now, might they decide to revise that map? Sure. I would expect that. However, they have something to go off of, right? And especially if it's a new teacher. Imagine showing up and being a brand new teacher and you have a map with your deconstructed standard, your student-friendly learning targets, lessons from your adoption that match it, and other ideas of high-impact strategies. I think I'd be like, that's cool, thanks. And then somebody hands me a stack of student work and says, here's how your students are doing on that assessment now. That'd be awesome. I would love my life. Now, this is one of the reasons why we don't have people score the assessment until they're back together with their new team. So in pre-service, that's when they're going to score that assessment. Unless you know the team is staying intact, then it's okay. But because we want the person who's going to use the information to score it. Because as you guys know, as you're scoring, you're making notes, right? Like mentally, you're like, oh wow, a lot of people are doing this or that, the other thing. And you also, it's challenging to follow someone else's scoring. They might mark it in a different way, they check things or star things, and you're like, does that mean it's wrong or it's right or right? So the new team is the one who receives the information, scores it, and then analyzes it to make an instructional plan. Now, that's the teacher side. So happiness all around, no concerns. On the student side, you might have high student mobility, and that's a reality of life. Even if you have 50% of your class that turns over, that's still 50% of the kids you can make a plan for before they arrive, and likely they're going to have a peer who's similar. Right? Like, it's rare that you get 30 completely different needs. You generally kind of have like these pockets and maybe an outlier or 2. So even if I only have half of the kids a good gauge on where they are, I can make a differentiated plan for them. And then when I meet my new friends, start to figure out kind of who they pair up with, right? Like who has a similar need to that person that I did know about. Does that make sense? Okay. Other thoughts, realizations, wonderings about May to May life? Yes? Okay, summer regression, this is another one. People always think, okay, it's not going to be reliable. Summer regression is real, but it's not nearly as massive as we make it out to be. And part of the reason summer regression is an issue is because we let it be one. So let me give you an example. Years ago, I taught 3rd grade, and the 4th grade teacher regularly told me that when they got to 4th grade that they told her they had never been taught how to make paragraphs. This was my face when she said that. I was like, really? I'm going to need to speak to those children. So what I decided to do one year was to make a end of the year packet for them that they did 4 separate samples using our same 4-square graphic organizer that we always use for writing. And they made 4 of them, and I told them, this is going to your 4th grade teacher because she wants to see what you can already do, right? One of them was a letter to the teacher. A couple of them were, like one of each mode. They had a variety. Now, so they all did them, and I was like, this is really important. It's going to your new teacher. She wants to see what you know. And so they tried very hard, right? Because this is exciting. Well, so then they leave for the summer. They come back in the fall, and sure enough, they're like, yeah, what's a paragraph? I never heard that word before. Yeah, right, lady. I was like, get those packets out. So I said, give them to the kids and see what they do. And she said, seriously, it was one of the funniest days ever. Like, she handed them out, and they were like, wait a minute, is this mine? And all of a sudden, I've heard of a paragraph before. I remember doing this, and all of a sudden the light bulbs came back on. Like, hey, you did attend school last year. So in some ways, yes, summer regression is real and kids do forget, and that's there. But it's also okay to jog their memory and be like, hey, do you remember these things? Because even if they forget, seeing it again will help them remember, and it will close that gap faster. It also kind of gets the left hand talking to the right, because the kids definitely work us in some ways of like, yeah, my teacher never did that. And then we look at our colleague and are like, are you teaching that grade, or are you just like hanging out, right? But really, they did do it, and we need to find a way to close that. So that can help with it as well. So yes, there's a little bit of jogging the memory, but it's not as much as we think, for sure. Other questions? Okay. I know this can be a bit of a game changer. I don't want you to feel overwhelmed if you're like, we are in no way close to this right now. You're thinking about next year, right? If you're here now, yay. If you're not here, you'll get there next year. That's fine. So here's what I want you to do. You guys are going to have about 5 minutes of work time. You've got your calendar there, and I want you to start discussing. If we're going to try to move to a May to May life, what needs to be in place? What do we need to start calendaring for now in order to make that happen? You might have some things, you might need to put other things in as a placeholder. And remember, you're not etching this in stone. You're starting to make a game plan of how can we angle teams to get there. Make sense? Questions, thoughts, wonderings? Okay, you got 5 minutes to work. May.
Working with you.
Thank you. And also with you.